Lead us, guide us, strengthen us to be beacons of that love, justice, peace, and mercy that you call us to. Let us not to make peace with oppression of others or our own. And may we and our nation and in this world grow to understand our call to a common humanity. We offer this all up in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, who lived and who we still await. Amen.
Amen.
Well, good morning, everyone. I will try to be brief here, but it is an honor to introduce Ray Suarez. I think many of you will know Ray as a journalist, an award-winning journalist. Some of you may know him as an author of several books and contributor to others. He was a host of, is a host of a podcast radio series, KQED in San Francisco called World Affairs, and he does reports in Washington for Euronews. He has taught, such as at the Amherst College. We may have an Amherst graduate or two in the crowd, I'm not sure today, as visiting professor of American Studies. He worked for many years at the PBS NewsHour and was a senior correspondent there until 2013. From 1993 to 1999, which is where I think I first came across him, or actually maybe earlier in his days at NPR, but he was the NPR host of Talk to the Nation for several years in the 90s. He's been a journalist for 40 years, having worked in London, Rome, Los Angeles, and Chicago. I'll just say that he's won a lot of awards, but I was impressed, as you might not be surprised. One of the awards he won was, as a reporter, he covered the first free and democratic elections in South Africa. And since our family had lived there 7 to 10 years after that time, that particularly caught my eye. His 3 books, he has written Latino Americans, The 500-Year Legacy That Shaped the Nation, The Old Neighborhood, What We Lost in the Great Suburban Migration, 1966 to 1999. And the most recent book, The Holy Vote, Politics of Faith in America, which examines how organized religion and politics have intersected. He's currently working on a 4th book on immigration, political, demographic, and cultural change. It'll be due out in 2022. He's contributed to other books, such as How I Learned English, Brooklyn, A State of Mind, Saving America's Treasures, and another book called About Men he contributed to, as well as published in the New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune. What you might not know, though, is that Ray is a long time Episcopalian. I'm not sure if I never did ask, was he a cradle Episcopalian or not, but I know he's a long time Episcopalian. He's a member of St. Columba's Parish in the Washington, D.C., and he is also a member of the chapter, which is the governing body of the Washington National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. He is also a clergy parent. One of his daughters, Eva, is a priest serving in New York City. So we are delighted to have you here today, Ray. And I'm just going to turn it over to you. As they say in Star Trek, you have the comm. We are talking about today, of course, this question around race and faith, with that question about the challenges we present or are presented with, and the hope that we possess. Thank you, Ray.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me with you today to talk about an uncomfortable challenge in our common lives. As citizens of a pluralistic society, and in this venue, as people of God at a time of unrest and division, we Americans have been talking about race more in recent years, but we haven't gotten any better at it. For too many Americans of European descent, attempts by their fellow Americans to talk about when race matters, how it matters, whether it matters, is too often heard as attack, as an accusation, as insinuation, instead of what it often is, which is just exposition, an attempt to bring personal lived reality into the conversation. How do I know it's not penetrating? How do I know it's not getting through? by the number of times the response is, "Are you saying I'm a racist?" How do I know it's not getting through? By the number of times the response is, "Oh, here we go again, the race card," when no particular card is being played at all. How do I know how often observations are going unheard? By how often the response is, "I'm so tired of talking about race," from people whose life circumstances have given them the luxury of hardly having to talk about it all, really, and not having it impinge on their lives in any way that they can really recall. It's a good thing for us to, in this particular venue, for some very good reasons, shaped by accident and shaped by history. For one thing, Paul puts the ideal of equality before us in his letter to the churches of Galatia, that there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. The ideal of a God who is no respecter of persons. But also, we're shaped by our own peculiar history because the Episcopal Church is a child of empire. There are brother and sister Anglicans in every corner of the globe. From back when the sun didn't set on the British Empire, it didn't set on the Church of England either. The Anglican Church is not a majority white church, but the Episcopal Church in the United States is 90% white. And being a 90% white church in a country that's roughly 67% white, it's a little out of whack, but doable, manageable. Being a 90% white church in an America that is minority white by mid-century is going to be harder to do. Harder to do and have a church that's stable and healthy and looking forward to 2100 with confidence. So I'm going to stipulate that everybody in this room today, everybody at the forum, probably won't be here in 2100. So some of this will move ahead by faith and the confidence that others will take up the struggle. So while part of me isn't so sure that hand-wringing inside the church about American racism is really what's on the menu, if I pause a second, I have to conclude that talking about when race matters and when it doesn't can't wait for some era in the distant future when the Episcopal Church looks more like America. That's just a recipe for never talking about it, so let's not do that. George Floyd crying out for mercy as one and then several uniformed officers knelt on his neck and on his back seems to have broken through for some people in a way that a long litany of outrageous killings did not. It may be that the accumulated weight of these killings finally got to a lot of people. Whether it's a boy playing alone in a public park, shot to death just seconds after a police car rolls up to him, or an officer in North Charlotte assuming a shooting pose like you would at the firing range and calmly gunning down Walter Scott, then that officer lied about it. Or Amadou Diallo, not a suspect in any crime, shot more than 40 times in the doorway of his apartment building, or had to have his entire lower digestive tract rebuilt through repeated surgeries after he was attacked by police with a nightstick, and on and on and on. There's grainy video of Ahmaud Arbery being chased by a pickup truck and shot to death. Breonna Taylor is shot to death after police forced their way into an apartment where she and her boyfriend are asleep. The accumulating weight of these outrageous events which used to be covered up, explained away, always went unpunished for decade after decade, are now seen on the evening news as you watch from your sofa, because we're living in an odd time when practically every American has a video camera in his or her pocket. So these are not some sudden, amped up, crazy set of overreactions that's a product only of the current age, but just the continuation of centuries of violence against fellow Americans whose lives were held as valueless or simply valued less, whether it's Texas Rangers killing Mexican farmers in border towns, cheery crowds posing for pictures at hundreds of lynchings, crimes where, let's face it, there were pictures that the perpetrators posed for in the commission of the crime. And nobody was charged, nobody was tried, nobody was punished. Just this year, largely symbolic anti-lynching legislation was defeated in the Congress this year. If we say, what's wrong with us? Why does this happen? Who are we? People who recoil at the question, don't even want to talk about the uncomfortable questions, answer, hey, wait a minute, are you calling me a racist? Oh, perish the thought. That race still has so much to say about the shape and the daily lived experience of American lives is a tragedy, or rather, an unending series of tragedies, large and small, that play out on the canvas of a continent-sized country. That race has so much to say about American life trajectories as we approach majority-minority America, when descendants of immigrants from Africa, Asia, and Latin America will outnumber those from Europe, is not puzzling, but predictable, as power, self-image, and anxiety combine to create ugly demonstrations like torchlight parades around statues of Confederate heroes, with crowds of white men chanting, "You will not replace us." Well, I wouldn't think of replacing you, and I'm sure your mother's told you you're all replaceable. I'm kidding. A few weeks ago, I got into an argument with someone online, which is always a bad idea, but sometimes it happens. A very 21st century kind of argument on a board where we're both members because we grew up in the same Brooklyn neighborhood. And this woman said she was tired of hearing about race because race just wasn't much of a factor in people's lives anymore. And if you worked hard, you could get ahead in America, no matter who your ancestors were or where they were from. I frequently hear this type of thing. It's certainly a very popular idea among Americans because, after all, who wants to think they're a bad person? Nobody wants to think they're a bad person. Who wants to think that they are participants in an unjust enterprise? Who wants to think that just by the very act of living, of putting one foot in front of the other and marching forward, you're somehow complicit in, contributing to the oppression of people you've never even laid eyes on? I can only imagine that's very frustrating if you were looking at it that way. But there are certain things we know about American life that bring up uncomfortable questions about our lives together in this continent-sized country where the answers are likely to take us to some very uncomfortable places. If you take mid-career Black men and mid-career white men of the same number of years of workplace tenure, at the same level of education, white men make a lot more money. Whether you're getting really granular like that, or comparing the pool of all 45-year-old men with a 4-year degree, or taking a snapshot from way higher up, aggregating much bigger, less sharply defined groups of men. When you compare Black families and white families of the same incomes, white families have 10 times as much accumulated wealth. Same income. So I'm not comparing a Black janitor with a white pediatrician. One major difference is that white families from all up and down the income scales have been able to successfully use real estate as a performing asset in family portfolios to build wealth that assures a more secure retirement and creates intergenerational wealth transfers. That's something that many, many white adults can rely on that very, very few Black and brown adults can rely on. The idea that at some point in their lives, there's going to be a settlement, there's going to be a will, probate, and you'll get some money that may help you pay for your own child's college tuition. It may help you, in fact, save for your own retirement. Far more often, when Black families buy a house, it's just a place to live. They simply cannot be confident historically in that house's ability to hold its value, much less have that value grow over time. When Black and white families enter real estate markets, Black families are rejected for mortgages at higher rates than white applicants. And, maybe you hear that piece of data and you say, well, they tend to have fewer assets and tend to have different profiles and lower credit scores. But even when you correct for the size of the down payment and correct for the family income, you still get turned down for mortgages more often. When Black and white applicants are both approved for mortgages, Black families at the same level of income are more likely to be offered something other than a plain vanilla 30-year fixed rate conventional mortgage, even when you correct for family income and the size of the down payment. So all kinds of families suffered in the Great Recession, for example, but more often Black and brown families had ticking time bomb mortgages that at the end of the story found them living as renters in the houses they used to own, or watching as county sheriff retained contractors stacked their family possessions out on the curb. Black and white Americans use illegal drugs at about the same rate. But even with that nearly identical rate of usage, Black people are arrested for drug offenses far more often than whites. But okay, let's move to the next level of analysis. When you compare Black and white people arrested for drug offenses, so they are at the same place on the starting line, Black people are more likely to go to trial. Whites are more often sent for rehab or some other form of unincarcerated diversion. Okay, let's go to the next level. When Black and white accused both go to trial, Black defendants are more likely to be convicted of the same crimes, that is, the same level of felony, charged for the same amount or value of drugs. And Blacks found guilty get longer sentences than whites found guilty of the same crime. When testers plug identical credentials, the same exact schools, workplaces, salary histories, into job applications, white applicants are called back for an interview far more often than people with home addresses in identifiably Black residential areas or people with identifiably Black names. When testers submit job applications, white applicants with high school diplomas get the same level of callbacks as Black applicants with four-year degrees. When I was a street reporter in Chicago, Black and white and brown kids had a detailed understanding of racial geography, knew where they were expected to be seen and where they were not expected to be. But I have to tell you, there's nothing sadder than spending the afternoon with a group of Puerto Rican kids in a barrio high school, with the spires of Sears Tower right there in the distance, right there, to find that half of them had never been downtown in their lives, even the ones with relatives who worked there, because they knew they were not wanted there, outside of ethnic parades or music festivals in the lakefront parks. They told me they knew they were not wanted there. They felt hostility from cops and storekeepers and the other people on the street. I tried to insist to them that it was their city too, that they not only had every right to fully inhabit their city, but they even had an obligation, because there were opportunities in being at home in the wider Chicago to make the city their home. And I left Roberto Clemente High School not really sure that they believed me, and not really sure that many of them were going to try it out. What's the accumulated power of these different lives? Why isn't there more of a perception among white Americans that there actually is a racial tax in this country, a life of shorter wages, lowered life expectancy, long-term dealing with stress-related disease that has some medical researchers concluding that the chronological age of a Black woman in her late 30s resembles that of a white woman 10 years older? Well, for one thing, we don't know enough about each other's lives. American life in residential terms is more economically segregated than it used to be. So while it's not impossible to know people in very different economic circumstances than yours. It's just less likely. The way we build housing, the way we set up school districts, the way we shuttle kids to this college instead of that one, enter careers that all play a part in tracking your life so that you are less likely to know people in very different circumstances from your own, less likely to have them as close personal friends, intimate connections. Maybe you saw that story about how a slight majority of Americans say they'd have serious trouble or wouldn't be able to get their hands on $500 in an emergency. That's more than 150 million people. And you may say, gee, I don't think I know anybody like that. That doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you flawed. It just means that a lot of Americans should catch themselves from time to time and think, who do I really know? Half of the country couldn't get their hands on $500 in an emergency. Do I even know anybody like that? So effect layers on top of effect. We're less likely to be vividly aware of the life circumstances of others, which makes it possible for large numbers of Americans to tell Pew and Gallup every year now that white people are the most discriminated against members of society, and never have to worry that many in their close circle of friends might pipe up and say, I don't think that's right. I don't think that's true. The choices, the circumstances, the daily details of life, managed and worried over and fiddled with, don't have us personally making the decisions that give a white family making 55 grand a year an okay mortgage and a black family also making 55 grand a year a crummy mortgage with crummy terms. You're not drawing boundaries for school districts. Somebody attending today's forum might be a local judge. I just don't know the members of your congregation, but most of you aren't. So you're not personally sentencing black men to longer time and white men to probation. Here, where you are, outside Detroit, you neither had a hand in Khalif Browder spending 3 years in the notorious Rikers Island jail, where he was sent on suspicion of stealing a backpack, where he spent much of that 3 years in solitary before ending his own life in a mental break. He was charged with stealing a backpack. He was never even adjudicated. He spent 3 years in one of the worst jails in America, so bad it's since been closed. You didn't have anything to do with that. And nor did you have anything to do with, I'm guessing, I'm hoping, raising the formidable pile of bail money that keeps Kyle Rittenhouse out of jail after he killed 2 people in Kenosha. Nor are you likely to be stoking the social media fires that build Kyle into some kind of hero. But we live with the consequence of those patterns and those decisions being made by others every day, and they reinforce themselves and they magnify their effects, these decisions do, which turns them into self-fulfilling prophecies. And then we respond to market forces created by these deep assumptions and hidden patterns. And the inequality of the past just keeps reproducing itself in the inequality of the future. But now, because of deindustrialization and offshoring and the unskilling of work, along with Black working class families finding it hard to get traction, hard to break out of discouraging cycles of debt and always being short at the end of the month, there are now millions more stuck, angry white people in the same boat. The same rapid downward mobility experienced by urban Black families starting in the 60s as good jobs left Chicago and Detroit and New York and Baltimore has now also hit millions of white families in Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio, all while enormous fortunes are being made, wage gaps widening, and resentment deepening. But the same despair, addiction, and family dissolution we pathologized in Black families in the face of their rapidly declining fortunes in the 60s and 70s. We now instead offer compassion and understanding now that white life expectancy for men is declining in these states, and the numbers dying from alcohol abuse, drug abuse, and suicide have tripled since the end of the 1990s. During that Facebook argument, my online opponent pointed to Black judges, entertainment entrepreneurs, local elected officials, and President Obama as proof that a Black person with the requisite desire can make it in America. Just as an aside, it's lovely American paradox. The same people who posted online pictures of Barack Obama in tribal garb or growing watermelons on the White House lawn, denying his birth in America, or calling Michelle Obama an ape, have not a moment's hesitation in pointing to the election of a man they despised and wouldn't vote for as proof that the country doesn't have a race problem. But I digress. It's true. Plenty of things in America have changed since I was a boy. My mother, convinced of America's rigid and unyielding distaste for Black and brown people, was convinced we were many decades away from having a Black president. She confidently told me a white woman would be president long before a Black man. I'm really sorry all the time that she died in 2007 and didn't live to see Barack Obama elected, proving she would have been happy to be wrong. And she would have been straight up astounded by Kamala Harris. But the feeling that America had done something significant, momentous, shared by that big crowd in Grant Park in Chicago on election night in 2008, well, it turns out we might have been celebrating a little too soon. I'm convinced that the road to 2044, the year the US Census Bureau has predicted the demographic realities of America will flip, that road is going to be harder than those people back in Grant Park imagined. When Barack Obama climbed on the stage, his wife, the descendant of enslaved people, joined him, along with his half-Indonesian sister Maya and her Canadian-Chinese naturalized American husband and all their mixed-race children. We patted ourselves on the back that night. And while the young president-elect might have expected some of what was to come, he probably wouldn't have predicted all of it. Our twin difficulties, talking honestly about race and admitting our discomfort with talking about it, meant that the first citizen of the United States, being a Black man, set off anxieties that never really got a good airing, and instead found other darker ways for us to work it out. The birther nonsense, the great replacement theory, which had been hiding like a virus in the dark, wet underbelly of the internet for years, but began to spread in the backlash to the Obama presidency and the continuing debates over illegal immigration to the United States. It's hard to put a number on the amount of national wealth we forego in throttling the ambitions of certain Americans while encouraging others. We talk a good game about opportunity and advancement, pause too often to reckon with what it means to an individual family to have two employed adults who are working below their capacities, training, and education, and thus being forced to forego opportunities to build family wealth. Multiply those small kitchen table-sized numbers by hundreds of thousands of households, and then millions. That opportunity cost percolates through the system and distorts everything it touches: homes, assessed values, tax bases, school budgets, Social Security income, life expectancies, intergenerational wealth transfers, and on and on and on. Is there hope? Yes, of course there is. My children all grew up in much more mixed circumstances than I ever could have imagined. Not in some precious Epcot Center kind of way, but just as an unremarkable, daily, reinforced reminder of how the country had changed. My children had Black classmates, teachers, and principals throughout their lives, and their expectation of what representation and fairness and equal opportunity look like is totally different from my own as a kid. when federal officers gassed and baton charged their way through Lafayette Park so the president could walk to St. John's Church to hold up the Bible, my daughter was in the front lines. She got batoned and gassed, and I begged her to be careful. She didn't honor my request, but I was encouraged by her passion, by her commitment to take to the streets in response to George Floyd's death. My other daughter, as was mentioned, serving a very wealthy and not very diverse parish in Manhattan, has had the occasion to preach some very tough sermons in the last 6 months about God's economy and the US economy and how different those two things look to her today. Before the pandemic, America was kind of on autopilot. We were rolling along and unemployment was low and the stock market was high and everybody was hustling and millions were scraping by. But who sends up emergency flares when they're scraping by? And frankly, who would care if they did? When the country began shutting down in March, and as the crisis deepened, and on its heels, millions took to the streets as well, the splits and tears in American society were showing too much. We were frantically trying to cover a queen-size bed with a twin-size mattress when governors told their economies to reopen. Some of the lowest paid workers in society, vastly disproportionately Black and Latino, routinely took the greatest risks low pay because the states were not closed in many cases. They could not protect themselves by staying home. They would be denied unemployment, stocking supermarket shelves, butchering pigs and chickens, taking subways and buses as home health care workers and hospital orderlies or in fast food restaurants. Low-wage Black and brown Americans have borne the brunt of COVID-19 as frontline workers and as patients, unable through the kind of work they do or from their lack of savings to simply step back in order to protect themselves. In the San Joaquin Valley of California, one of the richest agricultural areas on the planet, workers stand shoulder to shoulder, hour after hour, breathing and sweating and picking and boxing crops to give us food. They are told, we are told, they're essential. And then when we, down the road, have the luxury to start fighting about immigration again, we'll be told they're expendable. I'd like to believe we're moving closer to a more honest, more careful, more open national conversation about who really does what in this country, whose lives matter, whether we really belong to each other in any real sense, or are we just saying we do? Whether we come to a place like your church and my church here in Washington, pray, share the sacraments, hear the word of God, hear preaching that reminds us we do belong to each other, that America can be a better place, a fairer place, a more just place for all its children. If we then leave church, back in church, and head out into the world with our elbows out to protect our little pile of chestnuts and start saying things like, hey, I never owned a slave, and are you calling me a racist? Deflecting, avoiding the reckoning. Are we, in the final analysis, a scared people? Are we so convinced that the answers to these questions are zero sum, that if others have more, it inevitably means I'm going to have less? We have tough years ahead, we really do. We're going to have to face up to what we've told ourselves about ourselves for generations and contend with whether they were just pretty words or whether we really mean all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with inalienable rights that can't be taken away. Through it all, one of the greatest, most persistent gifts in American history has been Black patriotism. Through the gruesome suffering of the 19th century, followed by generations of Jim Crow, bold-faced types that you knew and heard about, and obscure individuals whose names you have no reason to know, kept trying to hold to account. Instead of simply dropping out in impenetrable alienation or starting a civil war, in every generation, a people created by this country and creators of this country and this culture in turn kept up their demands for something better, and continued to love a country that didn't love them back. And I can only call it, in 2020, a supreme act of will to have done so. I had a church friend. You know what it is to have a church friend, somebody who only exists like in Brigadoon. You only see them in church. You never see them out in the world. A church friend who had been a lieutenant colonel in the Army, was the head of the junior ROTC in all the high schools of Chicago, had been one of the first Americans to fight alongside South Vietnamese soldiers in that war in the early 60s. From his childhood in segregated schools, through a career in the Army, through a late adult life in a segregated city that didn't see a worldly, experienced patriot, just a Black guy. He never gave up on America, and he made sure his students wouldn't give up on America too. That's a gift being handed on. Thank God they kept it up even when they got so little encouragement in return. We would be a poorer, crazier, more unworkable, more ungovernable place if Black Americans ever attempted to give this country back as good as it gave them for the last 3 centuries. There's a reason Jefferson trembled when he remembered that God is just and wondered if that justice would sleep forever. There's a reason Abraham Lincoln reminded the crowd at his second inaugural that it would have been a completely just outcome if this country had lost all the wealth created by 2.5 centuries of unpaid labor. So what's the bottom line? We have to be less defensive, less convinced that we know things we really don't know. We have to make a little bit more room for each other. We have to be willing to be open to the life stories of people we don't know, and we have to admit we don't understand. We can't change history. There are no 18th century do-overs. We can't change what happened in this country after the Constitution of the fledgling Episcopal Church was drafted just a few blocks away from where the nation's Constitution was drafted. We can take stock of where we are and hopefully challenge ourselves about why those numbers are where they are today and what, if anything, we plan to do, need to do, want to do about them in the future. Thanks a lot. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Ray. I'm going to let Father Drew sort of first response, if we could. Go ahead.
Thanks, Walter. Well, and echoing Walter, Ray, thank you for your provocative, challenging, and also hopeful words. To think that I loved your phrase there at the end. There's no 18th century do-over, but we still have something to do today to take stock of our society, to take stock of where we've come and what we need to, and as you said, want to do about our future. To think that we have, we still have something to do within our power. I was struck also in our conversation, in your reflections, particularly about your childhood, which in some ways echoes my parents' childhood in Hawaii as a Native Hawaiian family. And to look at the screen that I'm looking at and to think of how far our society has in fact come from those days, to see a Puerto Rican man, an African-American man, and a Caucasian Hawaiian man in this conversation on race in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. I think a testament to the progress, but as you reminded us, there is still great work to be done. And I think that's important work for us to be talking about. You mentioned in the course of your reflections, a piece of history that is a bit before me, and I just was curious and wanted to know a little bit more. You were comparing the response to modern contemporary impoverishment in white America to 1960s response to, I think, Black America. And I born in 1973, the 60s and the 50s.
A kid, just a kid.
I'm sorry. So I know the civil rights. But I know it only through story. And so that was a piece that was a bit beyond me, and I wanted to unpack that just a bit more.
Well, I have been interested. I don't want to put too much of a value judgment on it, but it has been interesting to watch the response, real crisis among a lot of American men in the rapid rise in deaths of despair and the rapid rise in deaths from opioid addiction, deaths from alcohol abuse, chronic unemployment. It's actually started to happen so much that the life expectancy of these men is going down after a century when life expectancy did nothing but rise because medicine was improving, standards of living were improving, cures were being found for various things. So everybody could expect to live longer. Now, white men between 40 and 55 actually can expect to live fewer years than they could 10 years ago or 15 years ago. It's been met with a desire to understand what's going on in Youngstown, Ohio, and Lumberton, North Carolina, and Huntsville, Alabama, and the various places that are hotspots for this. It's been met with compassion, the feeling that there's a crisis afoot, that this is something we have to do something about. But if you look at the 60s and 70s, when factories packed up and left and headed first to the American South to go where there were right to work laws and no unions and no restrictions on hours and lower wage, hourly wages, first to the American South and then out of the country altogether. The things of our daily lives, play school kids' toys were made on the west side of Chicago. Domino sugar being made on the north coast of Brooklyn. Stereo equipment being made in Philadelphia as a successor to the vacuum tube industry and the medical medical glassware industry, which was located in Pennsylvania. As those jobs left, the Navy Yard closed in Philadelphia, the heaviest burden fell on less mobile Black men. White men could go to the suburbs in search of new employment as the center city deindustrialized. Black men couldn't, were not received well if they did try to follow work out to the suburbs. And so unemployment rates began to skyrocket, family poverty levels began to skyrocket, family dissolution levels began to skyrocket. And a young social scientist named Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who later became a United States Senator from New York, was a policy advisor in the LBJ administration and suggested that there was a crisis in the Black family and wondered whether it shouldn't be treated with benign neglect.
Yeah.
To let the system work this out. None of the compassion, none of the, hey, we ought to understand what's going on here. Hey, why is this happening? The burden of it was put on Black people themselves, where their own shortcomings, their own imperfections were the sources of rampant unemployment and family dissolution. We do not think there's something embedded intrinsic in being white that's causing the opioid crisis in Michigan, clapped out Michigan industrial towns in the lower peninsula. We don't think it's something inherent in whiteness that has more people killing themselves in places like northern Georgia and farm counties in Montana. So we try to understand what's going on in the lives of these people, and the observations and the reception is very different. Deindustrialization was not Black people's fault. When Dutch Boy decided to stop making paint on the south side of Chicago. That wasn't Black people's fault. And Dutch Boy moved elsewhere in the country, and all the people lost their jobs. When Wisconsin Steel in Northeast Indiana decided it no longer wanted to make steel in East Chicago, nobody said, it's because, well, we blamed the Black people who lost their jobs and eventually their pensions and even their health care because of the way bankruptcy law works in the United States. But we don't say those same things about the mill workers of North Carolina who used to make cannon sheets and towels in North Carolina and South Carolina, furniture workers in Boone, North Carolina, who no longer make furniture because the country's being swamped with imports from elsewhere in the world. We try to understand those people and understand their predicament while we pathologize the behavior of Black people facing the same exact crises. And now in drugs, now that it's taken on an aspect of drug use, we are now saying, oh, what should we do? How will we counsel these people and help them? We're not clapping them in jail the way we were in the late 70s into the late 80s and early 90s, where the jails filled up with drug offenders. And we weren't attempting to understand them at all. Very, very different. The same sets of actions, meeting with very different receptions based on who it was affecting.
Well, that's hugely helpful and illuminating for me. It touches actually into my heritage. As a young boy in the 70s in Hawaii, the image of and the stereotyped image of the lazy Hawaiian, who versus the unfortunate white Caucasian in the same situation. One, as you said, pathologized, one who blamed for their situation, one a victim of a greater event, and yet the same event has occurred. I thank you for that. That struck me in the course of your reflections on, even in my own lifetime, how minority communities are responded to differently than often white communities are responded to. One of the things I'm going to put out there for everyone, and then Walter, turn it back to you, to remind us to feel free to use the chat section in Zoom. I should have said this early on, and send a question, ideally with a Q at the front, to Walter or to me. You can send it out to everyone, but Walter and I will kind of moderate those and bring them into our conversation. Walter.
Thank you, actually, Father Drew and Ray, for that comment. To me, Ray, your talk, two things came to mind, particularly relating to this sort of pathology question. The one was that comes out of marketing. In the 90s, I worked for a mayor in Cleveland, and the NAACP chapter had billboards. It was a marketing to get people to join, and they said in 1990s, the billboard said, "Much has changed, comma, much has not, period. Join the NAACP." So because I think at that time there was this question, even in the 90s, what purpose would a civil rights organization need to exist, since all the quote laws that were discriminatory had been eliminated? So that's one thing. But the other piece, and this is profound, and I'm paraphrasing, you coming out of journalism, probably already know this, that there was a great journalist, columnist for the New York Times, James Scotty Reston Sr. His son, James Reston Jr., is still around. But Scotty Reston died in the mid-90s. He was 86 when he died. And he actually was born in Scotland, thus the nickname. Came to America and became a journalist and wrote for the New York Times. And when he died, I remember reading again in the mid-90s, it was a revelation to me. He wrote about in the early 1960s. I think this was a column. They did excerpts of his sort of greatest hits when he died. And one of them was just stuck out to me. He wrote around the time that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was being signed, that he could look, higher up. His Father Drew likes to keep us at the 30,000 foot level. He could look at deindustrialization that was happening already in the 1960s in America. And he said, it is a tragedy that the Black man, that America now, just as America is getting willing to consider accepting the Black man as a human being, America no longer has use for the Black man's labor. For a white columnist, New York Times, to actually see how this was going to impact, and how Moynihan, people have applauded Moynihan, and some revisionists say he was actually on point some ways, but then others still say no. But the pathologizing, if Moynihan was actually accurate, there would be sociologists today saying, what is wrong with Appalachian whites or Midwest working class whites when the stuff is going on? So, but Reston understood, I think a better sociologist is William Julius Wilson. When you take away work from a community like Detroit, I think Alex, one of our parishioners, talked about the Bronx last week when drugs came in. Well, drugs are often coming into places, like now it's opioids, where there is a lot of pain. And so these things go together. So to me, I thank you for your talk in bringing out back again how the economics as well as the sociological conditions are connected.
I was a student of William Julius Wilson's at the University of Chicago, and he wrote a book in the 80s called The Declining Significance of Race. And it's really a monument in contemporary urban studies. And he said, I started to get phone calls from people in the Reagan administration. And 5 minutes into the conversation, I would realize they hadn't read the book. They had just read the title. They were hoping that race was declining in significance, when Wilson's point was that in deep poverty, race matters less. In the kind of deep poverty that he saw growing in urban centers, that it became less important whether you and your master status in effect was that you were mired in deep poverty. And he wrote a follow-up book called When Work Disappears. That is a tremendous piece of work.
Great.
Because when work disappears, nothing else is possible. Nothing else that we consider absolutely vital to a shared, decent, civilized existence is possible.
Ray, one of the questions, a final question for you, and then we're going to invite, we have a small team of who will reflect on your comments with us. One question I have for you, though, is as we look at the issue of race, where we've come from as an American society, where we are today, and what awaits us in the future, as you reflect on what you've shared with us today, what would you like us to hear most clearly as we go forward?
That it's necessary to talk about the realities of different racial circumstances, and in doing so, not hear it as an accusation. The defensiveness of the reaction makes it impossible to have any kind of exchange about the undercarriage, the inner guts of these problems, the systems that keep reproducing these problems, because all anybody can hear is, oh my God, they're calling me a racist. And there's so much more to it than that. Interestingly, in the recently concluded presidential campaign, President Trump was entirely contemptuous of the idea that there was systemic racism in the United States. Yet it would really be difficult to come up with some of the results of the way our systems work unless there was at least some systemic racism. You'd say, well, God, how does this happen? If there's no systemic racism, how does this happen? And yet he would dismiss the effects or weight of racism in our shared lives, while then going on stage in various communities across the country, wooing white suburban women by threatening them with the possibility that multiple dwellings would be moving in and people would be moving in from the city. It was a weird 70s retro kind of political appeal that was so naked and so overt. I thought to myself, oh God, I'm sorry that I'm hearing this, that a political candidate in 2020 could think that he's actually doing himself a favor by threatening people with the possibility that city people would move in, with all its coded language and all the weight of history that's involved in saying that. And God, I'll be even more depressed if it works. And so
yeah, I'm going to follow up with another question, actually, because there's your comment draws out another thought from me. One of the resistances I have certainly encountered is exactly what you've named, which is as soon as we begin a conversation on race, the first response is, you're calling me a racist, or I'm not a racist, that it's all personal. When in fact, we are trying to talk about something much, much bigger than even the individual within it, although we have a role within the system itself. Can you help us understand the distinction between a personal accusation of racism and, as you've just illustrated, the reality of systemic racism? What is that that you're speaking of when you say systemic racism?
if you are ready to countenance a system where, by the luck of biology, some children in America get absolutely unquestionably superior educations, public educations, to other American kids, just because they were smart enough to choose parents who were going to raise them in Westchester County or Lake Forest or Winnetka or Wilmette or Grosse Pointe or Alamo Heights, and say, well, those other kids, bad luck for them. They should have chosen richer, smarter parents. They should have chosen to be born in a place where the school system is financed by more valuable houses. Not my fault that their parents own a cheap house. So while you have kids who can split the atom in their science labs in one high school, and then 3 miles away you have 4 kids sharing one Bunsen burner, because there's an invisible line between those 2 high schools. If you're willing to countenance that, and not at least interrogate, ask if there might be a way of doing this, or what's flawed about this system, then you're ready to continue to live with it, to shrug your shoulders and say, well, that's just the way it is, and life moves on. 65% of American school kids go to schools that are financed by real estate taxes. So if you happen to begin your life in a place where there are inexpensive houses, you are not going to get as well funded an education as you will if you begin life through no virtue of your own, through no choice of your own, through no actual action that you took on your own. You're going to get a better education. And if you get into trouble, you're going to get more help and more follow-up. than if you are born somewhere else where the houses are cheap. That's a country that's willing to roll the dice. And that's a country that, if you are profiting by that system, if you are doing well because of the existence of that system, you might want to rethink that and say, well, gee, okay, yeah, I live in a place where taxes are high. That's true. And those taxes are used to fund the local school. Some kid who just didn't begin life as privileged as my kids should also get a good education. It begins right there at 3 years old and 4 years old. The ability to move anywhere your family's income will take you is something that has been denied Black Americans, and to a degree Latinos, for generations. And because they cannot move anywhere their money can take them, they are, you might say, condemned to own houses that have very unpredictable futures, that may not hold their value or may not grow in value much more often than white families making the same choice and the same decision. Nothing's guaranteed, obviously. Nobody buys a house with a guarantee that it's going to be worth more. But as far as a performing asset in the family portfolio, if you are white, you are much more likely, at every same level of income, you are much more likely to buy a house that's going to be worth more 10 years from now than a Black family or a Mexican family making the same choice. That is systemic. It's not gross Bull Connor with German shepherds pouring the contents of a sugar bowl on top of somebody's head at a Woolworth counter, or blowing up their church. It's not that gross, in your face, direct, violent, jeering kids as they go in through the front door of Little Rock Central High. So everybody contents themselves with the fact that they're not racist because they don't do stuff like that. That ugly, direct, face-to-face, gross kind of heavy-handed racism. I'm a nice person. I don't do that kind of thing. So therefore, I'm not a participant in these systems. The systems are big, and a lot of people have a lot of interest in perpetuating them. And it's a tough thing. It's a tough thing to tease out. When am I a participant in this? When am I not a participant in it? When am I benefiting by this? When am I not benefiting? When am I a passive participant who, just sort of shrugs and says, this thing is too big for me as an individual to change, which it is. But still, you got to recognize it and be able to name it and be able to understand what its effect is. Even if you say, look, and with justification, I can't change that my neighbors will not sell to other kinds of people. I can't change that. But I do benefit from it, arguably. That's a tough conversation even to have with yourself. It's hard.
Yeah.
And it's hard to know what to do.
And I think your distinction between systemic racism and the brutal, gross racism of Bull Connor is a challenge for us. It certainly, I think of my upbringing, and when we think of racism, we think of that Bull Connor example, that's what racism looks like. And yet you're inviting us to look at society through a lens of race as well, and to see that the structure of our society, as you just mentioned, the educational system and the way it's structured, and on and on and on, all of the economic differences that you've helped us to see, has a racial component to it as well. And and not always a positive, in fact, a negative racial component that we refer to as systemic racism. And so that helps us to pull apart the layers of racism that we are moving through. We are fortunate to no longer, at least not as commonly, excuse me, Walter. I am. For a sec, Walter. You know, that by and large, we're not facing Bull Connors today, although as you noted early on, we still have white men marching with torches proclaiming Jews will not replace us, or you will not replace us. You know, we still have vestiges of that overt, in-your-face, brutal and gross racism today, but that is not the only expression of racism, both in contemporary or historic American society. And we need to be able to talk about both the brutal as well as the systemic expressions of race today.
The weird thing about the guys with the torches is that it defines racist deviancy in such an extreme manner that you can comfort yourself by saying, well, I'm not like that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Luckily, thank God, very few.
Actually, yeah.
But yeah, it is true. If we say that that's what racism looks like, and we aren't ready to look at it in other much more close to home ways, then we're patting ourselves on the back and buying into cheap grace.
Well, and it prevents us from really looking at how we participate. So I'm not Bull Connor. I'm not marching with a torch today, but I'm still benefiting from all of the systems of race through the years. And so I can denounce racism while still participating in its benefits, and not addressing them. And I think that's a danger that we easily fall into. Walter, I've been commanding the question, so I'm going to stop for a moment.
Well, I wanted to give. I think we've got Lauren, Lisa Barua, and Tom Nielsen, and if Susan Chaklos is still here, were some responders to join. But I did want to. I'm going to just put in the chat a New York Times article because I'm curious about this. And Ray, you may want to comment. We've talked about this issue of housing and property values. There is this great story. The New York Times ran it, and it's been on television from August, of the Albina and Alex Horton in Jacksonville. And this is not an isolated incident. The research shows this is a common practice with banks on home appraisals. Alex is a white man. His wife, Albina, is an African-American lawyer. They wanted to refinance like everybody in a nice white neighborhood where they live. But then the deal was the first appraiser came in and saw, there's some black people live here because there's black art and there's some black people on the mantle and photographs. And Albina, the wife, thought this was odd. And she ended up going to the bank, and they said, yeah, that is odd because the comps don't fit the neighborhood. Second appraiser came out, but this time Albina took all pictures of her family and their mixed race son, black son, took all of them out, put pictures out of storage of Alex's white grandfathers and, all the black art in the Black Panther movie poster in the kids' room, all of that taken out. Do you know how much more that second appraisal was? 40% more. I don't know if that is just simply, I think it is a combination there of both systemic, but also an implicit bias of the first appraiser. That i.e., and of course, that strikes home to me. I don't own this house, but interesting. If I were to sell it, do I take off my Malcolm X and my Martin Luther King things in the room and all of that just so I can get a better appraisal? It's sickening. And the sad thing is the appraisers board totally denied that that's a fluke, that's a coincidence, although they've shown with testers it happens all the time. I'm going to stop and let our responders jump in.
It would be one thing if it was 4%, but 40?
Yeah.
Come on.
All right. I just wanted to, I know Lauren has said some things in the chat, but Lisa and Lauren, Tom, Nilsson, if you all want to, just your responses, to what either Ray has said or Father Drew or I, or your own questions you want to, bring to our guest speaker.
Hi, Mr. Suarez. This is Lisa. Thank you so much for your time today. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I really appreciate the statistics and the data you provided us earlier about the inequities with education and homeownership and all of that. It helps put in perspective what the reality is and what those numbers are. You just kind of assume that that's the case, but to have the data really hits home. You had made mention of some people's thought about the differences being a zero-sum issue. And that's been something that I think about. And I think it's a reminder to keep that in the forefront when we see things and we think about things, that it is not, in fact, a zero-sum game. And we don't, as a culture, I think that we don't talk to our kids at home or in school or in social situations, or perhaps even in religious environments, that is what humanity is. It is not a zero-sum game. And so that leaves me with two questions. I'm concerned, I wonder, I think about how much of what we're living in now is due to a low participation in religion across the board in our country. How much of caring for your human person that we don't know is resident in religion, because we know it isn't in just non-religious culture. Does that play a role in this? If we had more faith-based activity as our culture, would that help improve where we are today?
You'd like to think so, but all those people who ended up in those lynching postcards went to church the following Sunday. So I'm always hesitant to make too many assumptions about personal decency and group behavior. Yet at the same time, the communal ideas that are shaped by religious teaching have to be transmitted somehow. And right now, we are undergoing a very, very rapid secularization of American society. If you are under 35, you are a member of the most secular generation in America in 200 years. The rate of non-affiliation to a religious group is skyrocketing. It is rising so fast that even sociologists who are specialists in religion are surprised at how fast it's happening. So we can no longer rely on a kind of National Council of Churches consensus morality to be the default position, and deviating from that being wrong or bad. There's no assurance of a shared morality that guides the society. So is it necessarily making it more difficult for us to tackle some of these problems when fewer people are religious? I don't know if I'd go that far, but I would agree, I think, in what's implicit in your question, that it's tougher to rely on a consensus idea of morality being transmitted to every new generation of Americans at a time when fewer and fewer people have the kind of religious upbringing that would have created a consensus set of values at another time in our history. Now, it would have to be done intentionally and purposefully because it can't be left to chance. The assumption, which is still held in some places in America, but fewer and fewer, that a person you run into in a social setting goes to church somewhere. You may not know them or know where, but they go to church somewhere. I've always been shocked when I've been traveling and reporting in the South, how kind of early on in a conversation, I'll be asked where I go to church, with the full assurance that I'll have an answer, which is almost as surprising as the question. I could know people for years in New York and never assume that they went, or that I would bring it up, or that I would ask them about it or anything like that. And yet it still always shocks me when somebody asks me in the South, sort of with the tone, with the assumption that, yeah, I'm going to have a name and a place and actually do go, as opposed to saying, oh, I'm sorry, I don't do that. Not involved in that. It is, there are still distinct American subcultures. The most secularized places in the country are the New England states and the Pacific Northwest. So the highest rates of lack of participation in a religious community are in Vermont, New Hampshire, Oregon, and Washington State. And that means for the church, capital T, capital C, our small corner of the church, but also the church writ large, maybe we'll be better at evangelism later in the century, when we can no longer assume that a church gets presumed pride of place in the social conversation, which it always assumed that it had throughout the 19th century, throughout the 20th century. Church sort of was the first among equals in mores setting institutions. That's just not going to be the case when more and more and more American kids are born and become adults in family settings where there's no religious identity and no religious affiliation at all. And it's becoming increasingly common. When I taught a course on this at Amherst, I assumed that my class of 27 kids would overstate the level of secularism among young Americans, which is around 35%. Not one kid in my class of 27 was actively involved with a congregation. And those are the cream of the crop of American undergraduates, kids who go to places like Amherst College, really hard to get into. And I thought, uh-oh, this is going to be a problem for the Episcopal Church. Will it be a problem for America? Whenever I see a poster on the highway that says "good without God," can you be good without God? Absolutely. Can you be a decent neighbor and my friend and a civically involved, make common cause with to improve the way we live in the places we live? Absolutely. Do I want everybody to be good without God? No. And so that's kind of the dilemma of being in 2020. I'm yeah, sure. You tell me you're good without God, I'm ready to take that at face value until you prove to me otherwise. But boy, oh boy, am I willing to roll the dice on an entire society that's good without God? Not yet. I don't think so.
You know, if I may ask a follow-up on that, on Lisa's question, Ray, from your experience, both professionally, but also as a layman within, in this case, our little subsection of the church, the Episcopal Church. Kudos on your tie, by the way. It has been noticed by at least one. I suspect several others may have noticed he's wearing an Episcopal shield tie. It's fantastic. So what is, in your experience, what do you think is the role of a relevant church today, and particularly in this conversation on race and society and American society today?
I think the Episcopal Church's recent experience of being a small church inside the larger church actually positions us well. If we're going to try to find some light in the current story, we're well positioned to speak to a wider country that is not already on our wavelength. I think the threat of irrelevance will be handled much less well by the Southern Baptists, who are used to being big and heard and influential, certainly in recent decades, where the head of the largest Baptist church in Atlanta or Dallas knows that someone at the White House will answer his phone call. Drew, I'm sure you have interesting things to say, but I'm sure you don't share that confidence that someone at the White House will answer your phone call, much less the president. So this actually is not a weakness, it's a strength, because we are already accustomed to speaking to people who are not already us and not already in full agreement with us. And we understand that we start with no already built-in advantage of prestige and power and numbers that mean you have to listen to us. So we've had to be more clever and more creative and more careful about what we say, when we say to whom. And I think that will probably be a good posture from which to fight the next big battle to evangelize America, because doing it from a position of power and prestige and social potency is not going to work in a society that's quickly bailing out on the church. See, he's muted, which it's almost like a meta, a parable of not being heard.
I was saying whether Tom or Lauren wanted to add a question or comment for Ray.
You know, I appreciate, Ray, what you've shared with us. The recollection that came to me as you were speaking was of that evening in Grant Park. I grew up in South Florida amidst the towns that were literally racially divided back to the days of slavery. I went to high school in inner city Flint, in a school that was set up to be 51% Black and 49% white in order to meet the desegregation requirements of the city. And so I very much had experience with being around others who were from situations that were very much not like mine. But it was that evening in Grant Park watching Black men and women literally weep that it occurred to me that all my life, the likelihood that I could become president was very, very small, but it was always possible. And for a large segment of my American brothers and sisters, they did not even see it as possible. And for me, that was heartbreaking.
For people who heard Tom's comments, you should know, because I've been in those conversations inside the group, inside the family, where we assure each other, nah, never, not going to happen. It's not done in angry hostility or bewildered frustration. It's just like a realistic view of the world. It's not, those bastards are never going to let us be president. It's more like, yeah, come on. We know the score. This is what life is like here.
I spend a lot of time trying to help my children set expectations. And so I always look at it as the setting of an expectation. But in the back of my mind, I always knew it was possible. And it was that evening where I suddenly came to the realization that for many, it never felt like even a remote possibility. Now,
I
I'm an
covered the
engineer.
early primaries in the '08 race.
Yeah,
You know, even when I would be at a bar late at night after running around Iowa or running around Wisconsin with non-white reporters, we would all talk to each other about how, well, you know, seems like he's a good guy and maybe he'll go deep into the primaries and all that. But it's even then, when it was just a couple of months away from happening, it didn't feel like it was real. So and again, it wasn't said in bitter dismay or shock or anything. It was more like,
Yeah.
hey, if it's raining, it's raining. You look outside, it's raining. You say it's raining. You're not angry. It's raining. You don't kick the cat because it's raining. It's just raining, and we're used to it
The-
raining.
I guess my question is this: if we know that these situations are out there, as an engineer, I've been trained to solve problems. So when we get into these conversations, my first bent is to say, how do I fix this? And I guess as I've studied the issue and have worked with this internally, one of the things I've learned is sometimes I just have to shut up and let other people suggest the solution, and then try to work to be the hands and feet that enable the solution that they would like to see. And I guess, so what is my role? If I do benefit from this system, how do I make that change without continuing to express my privilege?
Be one of the people in the room that when the only black person at the meeting looks around the room, they say, Tom, he's not a jerk. I mean, sometimes it's just as basic as that. Being the person that can be relied upon to make an observation that helps move the whole enterprise clanking and rattling down the road, instead of wanting to fight Gettysburg over again. You can't be the guy who fixes it all the time, but you can be all the time the guy who doesn't make it any worse. And sometimes, depending on what's at stake, that's called for. But listening is underrated, I think, frankly, because when someone tells you, this is what has happened to me before, if your default reaction is, oh, come on, that didn't really happen, or, well, maybe that was the conclusion that you came to, but maybe that's not what was really happening. Stop denying Black people's reality would be like a good first place to start with all of this stuff. Stop telling people that when for the fifth time they got there and the apartment was just rented after they meet the person who's supposed to show them the apartment, that maybe they're not imagining things. Yeah, sometimes the apartment was just rented. True. Not every time. And so, we're all doing this delicate dance. When I got to this area, it was sort of on the front edge of when Latinos were moving here in numbers. And I was having trouble selling my house back in Chicago, and I needed the money from that house to be able to buy a house here. So I needed to rent here and bring my family until I could actually, straighten that part of my life out and buy a home. And I wanted multiple bedrooms because I didn't want to share a bedroom with my infant daughter and my toddler son at the same time. And that didn't seem to be much to ask. So I kept calling rental places, leaving my name, leaving my number, week after week after week, and nobody ever called me back. And it was an interesting generational observation. My mother said to me, well, you should tell them when you call that you're the host of a national radio program with NPR, and then they'll call you back. And I said, Ma, if the only reason they're going to call me back is because I'm the host of a national radio program, but they wouldn't call me back if they just heard my name, I don't want to give them my money once a month. So screw that. If they don't want to rent to me, I don't want to rent from them. And eventually it worked out, but it was a reminder. I got a kick out of that after, because in a world where a lot of your self-composition went into getting over and not standing out and being acceptable and being someone that people would include in the room, I understood my mother's observation. I understood why she said that. It was out of care for me, not out of letting the side down or betraying La Raza or anything like that. But I also knew that I was at a point in my life where I didn't, if you're enough of a jerk not to call Rafael Suarez back on the phone because he wants to hire an apartment because you think you're going to get 15 people living in 2 bedrooms, then the hell with you. I don't want your damn apartment. But it was a great generational moment where I thought, oh yeah, she wants me to play the respectability card, reassure these people that it would be okay to rent from me, and on and on. And I wasn't having it, but
Thank you.
Eventually
Thank you.
we got someplace.
Ray, thank you for that. Yeah. We have Lauren hasn't had a chance to respond yet. I'd love to have her do that before we wrap up, if we could.
Well, first of all, Ray, I'd like to thank you for reiterating the historical, our history as a country, how that history has shaped our thinking about who we are, the mythology of this place being, equal, and how far off we missed the mark, and we've missed the mark. There's been fits and starts of people, when people start gathering together and collectively wanting change. Activism is what has brought about the change, and it hasn't been a pleasant undertaking. It's required a lot of bravery and a lot of perseverance in the face of great opposition. And this last 4 years has just been a testament to the push and pull of people in major disagreement and just basic living circumstances for people. And the fact that we have a president that has replicated what it must have been like in Nazi Germany, a president that encouraged people to beat up people that were in opposition, to run people down in the streets.
Who wants to wrap this up?
Witnessing this, and witnessing people in my own community that were in agreement with this tyrant and bully, and had nothing but good things to say about this person's actions, was like, it was so unbearable for me to watch and to listen and to hear and to not want to speak out. And when I spoke out many times, even within my own family, to try to illustrate why this was so egregious. And there were times where it felt like this was like we were living in biblical times, where the patience of Job was tested again and again and again. The plague that we're going through right now, that's been nullified in so many ways. Oh no, it's not real. It's going away. You know, the lack of acknowledgement of actual reality. People that are dying every day, and it minimized. It's going to take continued activism on the part of our the population that actually gives a damn, and great bravery and a willingness to be spat upon.
Well, you know, just in the last 6 months, there's been measurable movement being detected by social science researchers and opinion researchers about the state of America's racial attitudes. A lot of people are digging in their heels and insisting that they're right in attitudes that I think are unloving and unchristian, but millions more are saying they understand why kids went out on the street, that they understand why some of these more recent deaths were taken in a different way. One of the more discouraging this past year has been the manipulation and the trivialization of the simple declaration that Black Lives Matter. And it was such a falling short, such a lack of compassion and lack of empathy, a lack of moral imagination that left so many Americans unable to imagine what it would be like to be a member of a group who, over the 240-year history of this country, have been told again and again that their lives don't matter or matter less. And it was a sign of the defensiveness of so many of us that they heard it as only Black Lives Matter, when it was never that. It was always Black Lives Matter too. And the number of people who simply were not ready to hear that a group of people whose lives have rarely mattered were standing up and saying, our lives matter too, that it would be felt as an assault, that you had to answer white lives matter, was sort of discouraging. But the numbers are moving in the right direction. More people are willing to say, you know, well, maybe they have a point, and at least willing to say, I think actually we do have a problem here, and it's one that I have to understand more. It's the kind of thing that'll give you hope at a time when hope seems like it's in short supply.
It just seems like we need to keep up. It's good to have the hope, but you also have to keep acknowledging and keep realizing that if we don't keep fighting for better, things will just roll right back. And because more people voted in this election than in any other election.
If you believe that.
8 million more
I'm kidding,
people.
obviously.
8 million more people. Yeah, right. 8 million more people voted for Trump than the last time around.
Yes, absolutely. And that has to be taken account of as well.
And they're still out there protesting and saying that this election was stolen, and he's got everybody, fighting that fight still. So
one of the weirdest flexes that came during the time when the streets of all the big cities were filled with people. People were complaining. They said, yeah, I looked and not a lot of people at that Black Lives Matter protest were Black. And I thought, that's terrific. Hallelujah. That's good news.
Right.
that
Right.
not all the people that are, we're so used to civil rights marches and black rights marches being all black people saying, I want my rights, that the vision of
this was
lots of
definitely
different
hopeful.
Americans saying they should have their rights should be a hallelujah confetti tossing moment. Like, wow, everybody gets it. These people should have their rights.
Right. No, I know in Grosse Pointe, we had up and down Kercheval, there was a Black Lives Matter parade, and 90% of the participants were young white people. And that was a sign of hope for me, because when I moved into Grosse Pointe back in the 70s, there were no Black people. There was nobody that was Black at my school. I had moved from Detroit, from a school that was, it was in response to the busing issue, and it was 50-50, it was 50% African American and 50% white ethnic people. And so moving to Grosse Pointe was a culture shock for me. And, it was really 10 years after Martin Luther King had been there that I moved to Grosse Pointe, because I lived in Detroit during the riots. I was a 5-year-old girl at the time. But so it was a sign of hope this past spring when this parade went by in the midst of the pandemic, that people were brave enough to come out and to say, this has to change. That it is hopeful, even though there is still the backlash. There's always the push me, pull you, and it's going to take us, everybody coming to the table and trying to make sense of being able to figure out how to live together in a more inclusive way. If our country is to prosper, because our country, the way it is right now, and you might say industrialization, sending jobs away, that's a cyclical thing too. I think that eventually it may not be manufacturing that brings us back. It may be, this technological age we're living in, more people coming to the table and being part of that. But it is going to take, it's going to take time to get people on board with educating people, because education has been so sorely lacking in how we want to spend our public dollars. It's always the last thought instead of the first. It's always been, let's spend money on defense. Let's spend money on building a wall. Let's, instead of let's send kids to preschool early and advocate for reading programs and that it takes an educated populace to make a more prosperous nation. And I just think that there's not enough emphasis on that, and it needs to change.
Thank you, Lauren. It's 12 o'clock, and I thank you all for those who were able to stay on a bit past our normal time. I'm going to turn it back over to our rector, concluding thoughts. And I did just want to advertise, next week we'll be meeting again, 10 o'clock, coffee hour, 10:15 forum. And next week, the Reverend Peter Jarrett Schell, also from Washington, D.C., a white priest who wrote a book called, his topic is going to be, because I actually drew a blank on his book recently, but it's going to be about racial precedents and the sort of the emphasis or reality about whiteness from a young white priest. And Ray may even know Peter, but anyway, that'll be next Sunday. Thank you, Ray, so much for your time and your insights today.
Thanks for inviting me, Walter.
Yeah. Well, and I want to echo thanks to you, Ray. It's wonderful to have you with us and to lead us and with your reflections into this critical conversation on race and faith today. I want to thank Walter as well for helping to coordinate and organize these conversations so that these become possible for us. I want to thank everyone for your participation. As Ray said, listening is critical. Being part of the solution, even by not making things worse, is critical today. And for us to be open, for you to be open to this important conversation is a gift to all of us. And so thank you for joining us today. I do look forward to being with you next week as we continue this sacred conversation on race, faith, and society today. So thank you all for joining us. I know we all could keep this conversation going. There's much more to be said, much more to be heard. And so we'll look forward to picking it up again next week as well. So God bless you all. Thanks for being with us. And a final thanks again to you, Ray, for joining us this morning. Take care, friends.
Well, Drew, if we can ever be in a room full of people again, I'll see you at SEEP. But
I look forward to that. Exactly. All right, my friends. Take care and God bless all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.